Or
The problem with the cult narrative as it's conveyed through the media and also in the assumptions of law enforcement agents, and certainly it's been promoted by FBI agents, the problem is that it promotes something that scholars call cult essentialism, so that if something bad happens, say people die, then according to that perspective, all the blame goes on the so-called cultist and the so-called cult leader. And what that does is it masks or covers up the fact that the violence occurred in an interactive situation. And this has been really the perspective that the FBI or the government in general wanted to convey to the public. This was the perspective argued in the criminal trial and also the wrongful death civil trial, that all the blame went on David Koresh, primarily, secondarily on the Branch Davidians, and that nothing the law enforcement agents did had anything to do with the deaths. So that's cult essentialism, and that's conveyed in the cult narrative, all the assumptions that go into the cult narrative that's out there in the general public.
And I wanted to add that one person's cult is another person's sincerely held religion. And as a historian, I take a wider view of this. Early Christianity was a cult, according to the Romans. They call it a cult. You have a charismatic leader who thinks he's talking to God. You have a group of highly devoted adherents who follow that leader. That's the definition people use for cult. The Baptists were considered a cult in the early days of the colonies. Any religion that's unknown, that's different, that's strange, it's what we call high demand, where people go 2-3 times a week and they really get into it and it changes their whole life. Start reading the New Testament. This is what I teach. High demand religion, Jesus says, leave your father, mother, brother, sister, sell everything and follow me. You'd say, well, that's what cult leaders say. So the problem is, who's going to pass out the label? And we're a country built upon the First Amendment, which is anyone can believe anything they want. If they break the law, then we deal with breaking the law. But you can believe anything you want in terms of who's the Messiah, who's not the Messiah, this or that. And if you remember the day of the fire, I'll never forget this, President Clinton had a press conference in the Rose Garden, and one of his statements just jumped out at me. He said, maybe this will be a warning to those who may be tempted to join cults. The fire, the fact that they're dead. And I thought, I think he just didn't think it out much. He's just reflecting what people say. And immediately I thought, is the government going to issue a list of approved and disapproved religions? Because the assumption was we would know, don't join one of those things. But they're highly devoted Mormons, they're highly devoted, there are Baptists that go to church 5 times a week. Is that a cult? They say, I give everything to Christ, I'm gonna do mission work. Is that a cult? So that's the problem I see with that label.
Yeah,
the media just runs with it.
Yeah, you're so right. I'm thinking of the 18th century, the 17th century, with the Puritans in Massachusetts, whipping the Baptists and hanging Quakers.
They called them a cult. Right?
Yeah.
If you're not the establishment, you're different, you're new, you're high demand. Those are the things.
Yeah, the first president of Harvard became a Baptist, and they drove him out of the colony. It may be a Jewish group that the Torah manuscripts are so important, you would never tear them and burn them up. Maybe a Catholic group where the Eucharist represents the body of Jesus Christ. You wouldn't stomp it on the floor. This would cause great offense. So with the Branch Davidians, I think what we were trying to do for the FBI was to help identify those things that the Branch Davidians held dear, so that the FBI would not make a mistake and violate some of those things that were precious to them and precipitate a crisis that could end in a fiery death.
I know when I teach my sociology of religion class, what I try to get across to my students is, in a lot of cases, I don't think that's true of the Branch Davidians, but in a lot of cases, we're talking about a first-generation religion. And the reason that new religions fascinate me to no end is it's sort of like it's a laboratory to study how religion gets born, how it's birthed, right? And a lot of these movements won't survive the death of the founder or the leader. There is no second or third generation, but oftentimes when there is a second or third generation, you realize that the second generation are not converts, but they're born into the religion, and that sets into motion a dynamic of institutionalization.
Well, I think you hit on it when you said, was it to improve ratings, you know, to induce people to watch the coverage on television. In 2018, there were a whole slew of documentaries that came out. What do they want? They want viewers on the television channels. Or back in 1993, people were newspapers, they wanted to sell print newspapers. Now, newspapers are online, so what these newspapers want now are clicks, you know, so you can read the article but be exposed to a lot of ads. So cult stories attract readers.
There's another aspect to this. Back in the 1970s, when we started to see this kind of explosion of new religious movements in the late 60s and early 70s, we had the formation of organized opponents that eventually became tagged as the anti-cult movement. And those who were involved in this anti-cult movement specifically targeted these unorthodox, sometimes new, but not often, not always new, non-traditional religious movements, and used the term cult. And the term cult, as you guys know, got hijacked from its historical context and its meaning when it was described by, say, people like Ernst Troeltsch or Max Weber. And it became this, this term of derision, you know, and threat, and the term stuck, and it got in the popular consciousness as something that was always bad and evil. And we haven't been able to rescue that term from the popular consciousness, and we've almost kind of given up on the term and moved to more neutral terminology like new or non-traditional or unorthodox or alternative religions, because we can't seem to rehabilitate that term. So when I hear somebody use the term cult, the first thing I ask them is, define your term. What do you mean by cult? And they never can define it. They struggle because there is no real definition that matches this kind of evil impressionistic term that people use, because it's not supported by the empirical
Well, what if they say
research.
to you, well, wait a minute, doctor, it's obvious a cult member is someone who has been brainwashed into their commitment. How do you all understand that term?
Well, sociologist James T. Richardson speaks of two myths that are associated with the pejorative use of the word cult. First is the myth of the omnipotent leader, and certainly that was the point of view that was promoted about David Koresh. That's what the FBI agents believed about David Koresh. It robs the believers of agency, you know, their own decision-making power. And that's the second myth that Dr. Richardson refers to, which is, he calls it the myth of the passive brainwashed follower. And social scientists have disproved the brainwashing thesis. People make decisions about joining movements due to a variety of reasons. Maybe they're friends with the people who belong to the movements. Maybe they're related to them. Maybe probably the worldview appeals to them. And sociologists have shown that you join a new movement. If someone joins a new movement, frequently they leave before long.
The American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association formed investigative task forces to look into this concept because they wanted to introduce it into the social science language, mostly opponents or advocates of this term. And it was rejected roundly. The concept of brainwashing was rejected by the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association as lacking any kind of scientific or empirical rigor. So it's not accepted as an empirical concept. It only exists as science fiction or in the popular consciousness of the people. So ask them to define brainwashing, and again, they will struggle to come up with any kind of term or concept or definition that would be satisfactory.
Our colleague, Eugene Gallagher, a Bible scholar, he points out that apocalyptic prophets, or people who believe in apocalyptic prophecies, always interpret the Bible's scriptures in light of the events and the context. So they might have certain beliefs, but they're not set in stone. People with an apocalyptic worldview, apocalyptic perspective, they're always reading the signs of the time. You know, what's going on around them, what's going on in society.
They're making adjustments. And
they make adjustments to the prophecies, their understanding of the prophecies. So, yes, they had these beliefs. They had some beliefs that they might die in a fire, but that was not the foreordained conclusion of the siege. But the actions of the FBI agents in the very last minutes of that assault that they carried out on April 19th, not the first 6 hours, maybe the last 45 minutes, really the last 15 minutes, they might have decided that it was their time to die. So they, you know, even as the tanks are coming in, they're shooting in gas, CS gas, a very terrible type of gas, they were still interpreting the prophecies in light of everything that was happening to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one place David says, prophecies are warnings of things to come, that we might repent and change our ways, not cast in stone.
And church history is littered with prophetic failures, right? And many, many times we see, after the failure of a prophecy, the prophet will then reinterpret what happened, right, in terms of going forward. And one of the great contributions to the social science literature by Leon Festinger was to note that prophetic failure does not end the group, does not necessarily lead to the demise of the group, but they find a way to reinterpret or rework the narrative going forward.
But again, I keep going back to the question, okay, given that, whatever the circumstances were, how do we resolve a situation peacefully without loss of life that should have never happened in the first place? So now we're stuck, and we've got this 51-day siege. And regardless of what his views are about marriage or wives or children, how can it be resolved peacefully? And then, once he's out and in jail, which he expected to be, these issues can be dealt with legally.
Yeah, if
they have to be dealt with legally.